The following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this movie, you might want to before watching this review. It's been a good long time since I posted any episodes of Superhero Rewind, so I want to thank everybody for your patience and for coming back for another one. Today we embark on another theme series. We've done pulp heroes and precursors to the modern-day superhero. We've done critically panned films. We've done superhero parodies. This time, we're going to tackle fan films. I announced this project as a single video initially. My intention was to do an overview of fan films, discussing fans' motivations behind making them, the vast institution it's become since the advent of easy video posting on the internet, and some of the major pitfalls a lot of these films tend to fall into, mostly by briefly examining a few of them. But as with so many things, my thoroughness has gotten the better of me. I chose these films based on a poll I took of my audience, and you guys suggested some things I'm finding I want to do a full-blown analysis on. So I'm going to explore those and other ideas through separate individual reviews of these films. I was a little leery tackling fan films in this format because since they're often made by novices and don't have the benefit of lavish budgets, and since they're made out of love and reverence for the material and not just to make a quick buck, it's hard to hold them to the same standards as we hold those official superhero movies. Especially because while it's easier than it's ever been to find an audience for these films and really to make them, they still aren't seen by the number of people who will go to the theater to see the next, say, Batman or buy it on video. The films sanctioned by the owners of superhero properties and produced by major studios are the ones that shape public awareness and opinion of these characters. And even the most open-minded and critically objective fan is going to care more about whether the Superman-Batman movie in 2016 is any good than he did about the quality of Batman's City of Scars. But several of the movies recommended most by my viewers seem to hold up quite well to scrutiny. It's crazy how the standards are rising with these projects. These producers are putting their hearts and souls into some of these movies, and it's becoming a serious business. Despite not being able to sell the films for profit, there's a lot to gain from making or being in a highly regarded fan film. These days, a lot of talent is getting found through these. Many of these movies get their own IMDb pages and are considered legitimate films, if not official releases. They look good on a resume. For example, Scott Mcclure has become a serious name in independent film circles for his work in the Joker blogs. He gained so much notoriety that Warner has invited him to their studios to get a peek at the script for The Dark Knight Rises before it was completed, which he was allegedly using to inform the next season of his web series, although it didn't start airing until after Rises was released. Speaking of, I'm going to tackle standalone films in this series, but I do plan on doing a full review of the first season of the Joker blogs sometime down the road. Oh, and just so we're clear, these are extra things. I know I said I'm going to review every superhero movie ever made, but I did mean official ones. I'm not planning on reviewing every fan film ever made, but I do want to focus on a few that are well produced enough, I think, to deserve a close look. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to do full reviews and analyses of 4 fan films, and just as I do with major motion pictures, each of these will be at least 2 years old. I'm only tackling well-made films with some sort of production value and more high-profile things that a lot of you are likely to have seen and will care to hear full-fledged analyses on. But a lot of the biggest issues that tend to really hamper fan-made projects can be found in some of these. I think the 3 biggest things that hold back fan films are poor writing, inexperienced actors, and then ambition. A lot of fan film creators get off to a good start, and then get in over their heads with grandiose visions they can't hope to effectively realize with their limited resources. And that's the biggest one. Learn from the Twilight Zone. Minimalism. Let your limitations make you more creative. Most importantly, write a story you can realistically make believable with what's at your disposal. If you've made a fan film and struggle with this, I feel your pain. Spawn Year became a much bigger production than I ever expected it to, and that's why I'm still not finished with it. And I've tried things I wasn't quite prepared for. The hole in my chest didn't always look so great. The set was a little small to choreograph a fight with a Vince Zombie clone, but I do know better than to try explosions. The Punisher Dirty Laundry is one of the best examples of how to use limited resources to your advantage and tell a darn good story. The term fan film is a little strange with this one, though, given that it's made entirely by industry professionals. It is a fan film in the sense that it's made by fans for fans, just for the fun of it, because they love this character. But although it wasn't sanctioned by Marvel and nobody got paid, and it's shot on a shoestring budget, it's for all intents and purposes a professionally made movie. It's directed by veteran music video and feature film director Phil Joanau, and it stars Thomas Jane, reprising his role as the title character. And did you ever think you'd see Ron Perlman, of all people, show up in a little 10-minute short film for no paycheck? Recently, producer A.D. Shankar did an interview with Screen Rant about his and Joanau's second fan film project, Venom, Truth, and Journalism, and he said that he feels compelled to make these grittier, R-rated type versions of these characters because there's just not much room for them in Hollywood right now. He says superhero movies are basically Pixar movies now. They're for kids and adults alike, and they all have to be kid-friendly enough to get a PG-13 rating. I'd argue with him a little on that, at least in calling them Pixar films. A lot of superhero movies are really edging the line of PG-13, and in my opinion, movies like The Dark Knight Rises and Man of Steel aren't really appropriate for kids under the age of 12, depending, of course, on their mental age and things like that. But his point stands. R-rated superhero movies rarely do that well at the box office, and so we're seeing a lot fewer of them. If you look at the ones we've had in recent memory, Punisher Warzone, Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, even Watchmen, they usually see pretty disappointing returns, at least compared to projections. There are exceptions when you broaden it to movies based on comics, Sin City or 300, that aren't also superhero films, but I think those appeal to an older crowd inherently that doesn't all even have to know or care that they're based on comic books. So anyway, besides just loving a character and wanting to see your own unique vision of it realized or something closer to the source material, or just a character moviegoers and studios seem to have lost interest in, another big reason some people make fan films is because they can do something grittier or more realistic, not watered down, and there's no one to tell them no. Now, arguably, some superhero movies are already more gritty than some people would like, but not necessarily because the story demands it, just because dark and edgy is what's in. I like a lot of things about Amazing Spider-Man, but there's no reason that color palette had to be so bleak. Still, with characters like Punisher and Venom, Joanau is totally on point. It's not about being rougher than studios want you to be, it's about telling the story you want to tell without politics or demographics getting in the way. This movie really requires its grittiness, and I think that has a lot to do with why we're seeing the pros branching off and making more of their own content, free from studio oversight. I guarantee Dr. Horrible wouldn't have been the same if it was traditionally produced or distributed through regular Hollywood channels. When professionals take on projects like this, their passion for the work becomes clear, and we're seeing more and more of this all the time. I know this isn't superhero, but like with the fan film series Star Trek Continues, produced by professional voice actor Vic Mignogna. Everybody who works on that series is experienced in their field, working on their off time for no pay just to get to make something they really care about. It's not like me in my basement making Spawn here. These people, regardless of their success and celebrity, are obviously in it for more than just the money and fame. And as the resources and technology it takes to make a cinematic-looking film become cheaper and more widely available, it becomes that much easier for anybody to put together projects like this one, as long as you know what you're doing. Not to mention the ease of distribution and publicity we enjoy with YouTube and other video hosting sites now. Even if you were a well-known actor and director and you wanted to make your own unlicensed, not-for-profit Marvel movie back in, say, 1992, and even if you had the spare cash to finance it and make it look presentable, you'd be able to show it at a few film festivals, maybe hold a few private screenings, and make some VHS tapes and hand them out at conventions. But that's about it. And there would have been a lot of extra expense there, too. I'm sure there's a lot more incentive for well-established names who work for a living to create more art for the sake of itself when they know a lot of people will have the opportunity to enjoy it with a simple click of a button. As they say, it's not the weapon you wield, but how you wield it. Dirty Laundry is a very simple, gritty movie that's all about the ideas and not the spectacle. It's not trying to wow an audience with special effects that can't be properly pulled off on a small budget. What stunts are here are done practically, and they look good. And it's not trying to be the be-all, end-all Punisher movie either, though the cast and crew have described it as a nice transition into a potential Thomas Jane sequel, were that to ever come into fruition. This is a snapshot, just a few minutes in a day of Frank Castle's life, and at first glance it seems a little insignificant. Frank goes to a seedy neighborhood, does some laundry, sees the leader of the local gang raping a prostitute, ignores it, and goes about his business. And then, as things outside escalate and the gang leader continues to terrorize the locals, Frank finally decides to do something about it, and he does precisely what you'd expect the Punisher to do. He punishes them. But on closer examination, these 10 minutes are incredibly dense, masterfully using this simple situation to ask some interesting and thought-provoking questions. And it's a legitimate story, not just a cute skit or a scene that feels like it was pulled out of a larger narrative. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. A protagonist who goes through a complete and compelling character arc, who has to deal with an external and an internal conflict, and a great deal is revealed about him through the choices he makes. Hollywood is rarely this efficient in its 2-hour superhero fare. This thing gets the job done in the time it takes to make an omelet. I love short fiction. In prose, the short story is my favorite form. If you give an artist a smaller canvas, he's got to be that much more creative in his presentation. Writing a short story, in a lot of ways, is harder than writing a novel because every word counts. You can't run off on tangents or develop elaborate subplots or describe every last detail of somebody's living room. You show us nothing that doesn't reveal something about your characters. Now, as a rule, the same should be true of novels and feature films. As I always say, it takes the time it takes to effectively tell a good story. Some stories, like this one, are better suited for a short film. No need to add a hot dog vendor on the sidewalk, or a natural disaster, or a love interest, or an alien invasion just to pad the thing out. But the longer the work is, depending on how complex your story is, the wordier you can get away with being, or in the case of film, the more time you can linger on things. For example, Frank's conversation with Big Mike, the handicapped convenience store manager, could have been a lot longer, and I'm sure those of us who love Ron Perlman would have appreciated the extra screen time as he and Frank BS'd about natural disasters or alien invasions. And it still might have been a perfectly effective film at 15 or 20 minutes. But what I like about this one is how economical it is. Joanau is so deliberate in every single thing he's showing me that he keeps my full attention the whole way through. The movie is about apathy, about how people often won't stand up for what's right because they don't think it'll do any good. When Frank looks out the window, watching the gang harassing a poor kid and trying to force him to run drugs for them, Big Mike says there's no point in stopping them because there's always someone else to take their place. He holds the old cynical position of, this is just the way the world is. Frank doesn't immediately get involved, and we're not told why. He's a little-spoken man, and he happily doesn't narrate for us, so we don't get inside his head to find out exactly what he's thinking. But if we've seen the Thomas Jane Punisher movie, which this short, both tonally and character-wise, is following nicely, we know that this is a guy always on the run who has to keep a low profile. Given that we don't know what Frank has been through lately, only that his shirt was recently riddled with bullet holes, I suppose it's entirely possible that he's considering giving up his vigilante lifestyle, and that's the reason he doesn't immediately get involved. But I doubt that's it. I think Frank just doesn't have a dog in this fight, and he doesn't want to stir up unnecessary trouble. Or maybe he's been through something pretty brutal recently, and he's just not up for this today. But Big Mike's words work on him like unintentional reverse psychology. When Mike says things can't change, Frank's reminded of who he is and why he's done the things he's done. It doesn't matter if his actions create lasting change or not. Today, an innocent girl was raped, and an unsuspecting kid was almost forced into indentured servitude. On the other hand, when Frank puts the lighter in front of the gang leader and places his life in his victim's hands, perhaps he hopes he's putting them in a new position of power, and that when he leaves, there really will be longer-lasting effects. I like the subtle but crystal clear way we're given information in this film. We know the death of Frank's family is at the forefront of his mind because we hear their screams in his dream when he wakes up in the back of his truck, right at the beginning. Likely, that's always at the forefront of his mind. Frank punishes these men for the same reason he punished the men that murdered his family, at least in the Thomas Jane movie, because nobody else would. Chaos and savagery rules this neighborhood, but only because the good, civilized people won't do anything about it. And Frank's opportunity for change is interesting, because in a way, he chooses to change, and in another way, he doesn't. He changes in that he decides to act, when before he tried to ignore the injustice happening around him. But he doesn't change in the sense that in stopping these men, he's submitting to the same code he's been living by since his family died. He's able to look the other way for only so long until it's all too much for him. His belief that these men deserve what's coming to them overwhelms any other selfish or tactical motivations he might have had. And so this is also a story about human nature, and the film is really smart in the way it leaves it all up to the viewer's interpretations at the end. Has Frank given in to his personal nature, or for his worldview, was he giving in to a baser nature earlier in the film, putting his own needs and feelings over these strangers who needed his help? Does Frank fight the same apathy Big Mike has embraced in favor of his ethical code? I think the film calls into question whether there's such a difference between the people who destroy other people's lives and the onlookers who stand there and watch. Both are completely self-serving, and both illustrate a total disregard for the sanctity of human life. It's really interesting how the film manages to make Punisher's morality the higher morality here. Yes, he's brutalizing and killing people, and most of us wouldn't condone that. But within this context, with this almost bizarre juxtaposition of regular civilized people doing legitimate business right in the middle of other people living the most primitive, barbarian-level existence, it's hard not to think that Punisher's got the right idea. At the end of the film, Frank does something totally unexpected. He leaves the gang leader completely battered and soaked in alcohol, and then he leaves a lighter for any of his victims to finish the job if they choose to. He delivers the only line in the short that defines any clear theme or philosophy. He asks, what is the difference between punishment and justice? This calls back to the ending of the 2004 movie. Frank doesn't wait for an answer, nor does he give us one. He lets what happens next answer the question for us, and again, leaves things ambiguous enough so that the viewer is invited to provide his own interpretation. Remember in Batman Begins when Bruce tells Rachel that sometimes justice and vengeance are the same thing, and she says that vengeance is about making yourself feel better? I've always seen the Punisher as what Bruce might have been had he actually shot Joe Chill there. I think Frank would agree with Bruce in that scene, especially given what he does here. When we think of justice, we think of phrases like, the punishment should fit the crime. Being just is about being fair, and that's a subjective concept. Not everyone is going to agree on what a criminal deserves. There are murderers, but not everyone believes they should be put to death. And yet the words justice and punishment often go hand in hand. Even if you don't believe in capital punishment, you probably believe in some sort of punishment. You probably wouldn't believe it's just to let this rapist and drug lord get away with his crimes scot-free. The Punisher is a guy who deals his own brand of justice. He and, say, Superman might both use that word, but they wouldn't agree on its definition. My interpretation of this depends a little of my knowledge of the character and the previous material that's informing this, but again, they're pretty close in tone, and Jane's performance is exactly the same guy, so I think I'm maybe within my rights to consider that other material and look at this like a sequel. So I'm thinking that the distinction the Punisher is making here is about the emotional investment of the people involved. That in some cases, for justice to truly prevail, the people who were wronged need to have a say in what's done with the person who wronged them. In the 2004 movie, Frank had to take it upon himself to do something about the criminals who killed his family, because the law wasn't getting the job done. And this community, who Mike, I think, is representative of at large, has the attitude of, as long as it's not me, I'll pretend like it's not happening. So the Punisher can punish these people, but from his perspective, because it's not his fight, because he doesn't have the emotional investment the prostitutes and the kids have, is it really justice? So perhaps the answer to the question, if your name happens to be Frank Castle, is that punishment is simply hurting someone for doing something wrong. Anybody can do that. But that justice is vengeance, and that requires those who have been done wrong directly to be involved in that punishment. Now, that's certainly not a position I would support, but Frank Castle is an extreme personality with an extreme philosophy. What makes it interesting is those little grains of truth. There's a certain logic to the Punisher's worldview here. And now let's talk symbolism. These 10 minutes are chock full of it. As I said before, there's nothing on screen that doesn't serve a purpose. And like a lot of great stories, you can smell the subtext, but that doesn't mean there aren't multiple ways to read between the lines. The movie does a lot with the idea of cleaning things. The Punisher is doing his laundry, he helps clean up the streets, the bad guy dies in a baptism of water, Jack Daniels, and fire. When Frank is watching his clothes spin on the laundromat, we see him fighting with himself as he listens to the screams of the innocents outside. I think we're looking at Frank's inability to be clean. He's trying to ignore the injustice, but inevitably, he's gonna have to get his hands dirty. His clean clothes might represent how foreign and uncomfortable the idea of cleanliness has become for Frank. To do what he does, he has to get gritty and bloody and gross. And he's sitting in this laundromat, getting his stuff clean, while the filth of the streets destroy good people outside, and he's doing nothing about it. Which perhaps makes him feel a whole lot dirtier, here. I might be reading way into this, but I wonder if his giving the kid his Punisher shirt at the end, besides just to finally get the logo on the screen, might be furthering that idea. He's the Punisher. He has to be filthy to fight the filth. Getting rid of a clean Punisher shirt might represent that. By the way, I love the ending, and I almost think it's a better movie if you didn't know the Punisher was going to be in it. Nothing about the film confirms for sure that it's the Punisher until the last couple minutes. He's never referred to as Frank Castle, but there are a few little hints here and there, like the screams in the dream he wakes up from, and the bullet holes in his shirt turned inside out so we don't see the symbol right away. I also really like the focus on the claw machine inside the laundromat. We're seeing these objects from Frank's perspective, and he's conflicted. So I'm led to imagine what he's thinking of when he looks at them. I think the claw machine, then, might represent the unsuspecting people who live in this terrible neighborhood, trapped in this awful place and waiting helplessly to be grabbed at any time by this intimidating, powerful, unstoppable force. The only real complaint I have is with the soundtrack. I'm a little dismayed that in a project this well thought out, with volunteer acting talent like Ron Perlman, Joanau couldn't find some musical talent willing to produce 10 minutes of score. The music used is Joker's theme from The Dark Knight, mostly the stuff in the mob bank scene at the beginning. It's all appropriately placed, and it's tonally the right sort of beats, building suspense and adding to the overall unease of the situation. And it'd fit just fine if I wasn't already familiar with it. Even when it sounds like the music could have been written for the film I'm watching, which is kind of the case here, it takes me out because I already associate that score with another project. It's building a somewhat different sort of tension than it is in The Dark Knight. It's reflecting a protagonist's internal conflict rather than an antagonist's chaotic and unpredictable nature. It's used sparsely enough that I only have that hang up in a couple of places with it. Dirty Laundry is a fantastic example of the depth of storytelling that can be accomplished, not only on a small budget, but also in a short amount of time. Yes, this review is a lot longer than the film, and that's because it takes more time to digest, consider, and draw conclusions from these scenes than it does to watch them. Fan films like this one really raise the bar and encourage other filmmakers to use their limitations to their advantage and to focus on the things they have most control over, the writing, the acting, and the editing, over trying to create a grand spectacle. The good news for anyone wanting to make their own fan film is that those things you have the most control over are also the most important things. Movies are about telling stories, and if we care about a character, he's played by someone believable, and we're engrossed in his story, a lot of production details are easily forgiven. I'm giving Punisher Dirty Laundry a 3.5 out of 4. Next time I'll be tackling the Casey Jones fan film. Stay tuned.